breathed Harry, creeping to the window and pushing it up so they could talk through the bars. "Ron, how did you... what the..." Harry's mouth fell open as the full impact of what he was seeing hit him. Ron was leaning out of the back window of an old turquoise car, which was parked in midair. Grinning at Harry from the front seats were Fred and George, Ron's elder twin brothers.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Belated Binge Podcast. I'm Zach, your host, revisiting some of the most iconic series in recent memory that I was incredibly late on, like our current binge of Harry Potter, where, despite being the same age as Movie Harry, I didn't read this series through until my mid-20s. That's the belated part. Now, we're going back a chapter or two at a time, picking it apart, deep diving what's on the page, speculating about what isn't, particularly Dumbledore's role and his master plan. What did he know? When did he know it? And the greater motivations guiding the story. And of course, infusing as much sarcasm as humanly possible. That's the binge part. Together, they make the belated binge, and today we continue our reread of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets with Chapter 3, The Burrow. But before we get into it, this podcast will have spoilers. If you haven't read these by now, you're even later than I was. Seriously. It's like been decades. This podcast could also have some adult language, and by could, I mean will. You can buy these books in the kids section at the bookstore, but I didn't read them until I was a grown-ass man. Special announcements. I mentioned before that I'd have more guests on for this particular book. That is in comparison to last season when we did the first book. So I figure it's good a time as any to tell you that the first guest is going to come on in 2 chapters when we hit Chapter 5, The Whomping Willow. This one is a radio professional, an old coworker, and a personal friend who happens to also be a Potterhead, and I think has listened to every episode that I've released to date. I can only promise that we will go off the rails multiple times. We'll likely do a lot of cursing, a lot of laughing, and I'm excited about it. And that is going to be the first guest of this season, a season in which I said before I plan to bring more of them on, and so far I have 6 lined up who have picked the chapters that they want to cover and a couple other possibilities, so I'm actually pretty excited. That's already way more than the 2 that we had last season. Again, the first coming in 2 chapters for Chapter 5, The Whomping Willow. But we're not there yet. And in case you were obliviated, or you got your Hogwarts letter late, last chapter, we covered Dobby's warning, and it was a shit show. We learned what a house elf was. We got introduced to wizard slavery. We learned that there's a plot to make bad things happen at Hogwarts this year, so this little dude has been stealing Harry's mail, which is a felony here in the States, I think. Don't be messing with people's mail. When Harry wouldn't agree to stay away from school, Dobby used magic to smash some pudding, causing a chain reaction of an owl crashing a dinner party, Vernon losing the sale of a lifetime, Harry receiving an official warning about using magic outside of school, and losing his only leverage that he had at the Dursleys that kept him living there in a remotely bearable state. Now that they know his Hogwarts hands are tied, they've done everything but hog-tying the rest of him. He can move his arms, but there are bars on his windows, he's fed through a cat flap in the door, and he's let out twice a day to take a shit. We ended the chapter with him waking up in the middle of the night to Ron staring at him through the bars on his window. Before we can move on to this week's chapter and figure out if Harry's hallucinating or if Ron is actually there, we need to close the book on last chapter. And that means recapping our
Expecto Plot Change-O.
This is the part of the show where we theorize what we would expect to change in our story if we made one small adjustment to the plot of the chapter that we're covering. In Chapter 2 of Chamber of Secrets, Dobby's Warning, I asked, what if Harry just lied to Dobby? Said he wouldn't go back to Hogwarts. Would the elf perhaps left him alone? Would Harry have gotten the letter about underage magic at all? Would Dobby have kept tabs on him still and took the same future actions that he's going to take in the book anyways? Or maybe even done worse? Would Vernon have actually made his sale? From my perspective, Harry's kind of a shitty liar. So I'm betting he would have gotten himself caught by Dobby, like, right away. Dobby would probably know. I don't expect Dobby to be a legilimens by any stretch of the imagination, but I also don't have a whole lot of faith in Harry's ability to fabricate the truth, particularly a now 12-year-old Harry, in the face of a house elf that he's never seen ever in his life. He probably would have offended Dobby. Dobby still probably would have ran around the house squealing like a banshee. Probably more magic, probably more chaos, probably more punishment, the whole 9 yards. I asked this question in particular because I've heard people suggest that he should have done just that and just lied to Dobby, and on the surface, that's probably 100% true. If Harry just told the elf what he wanted to hear, he might have gotten out of the mess. But I think even if he didn't give himself away in that moment, and Dobby did somehow believe him, Dobby wasn't just going to leave it alone. We still get the events to come where Dobby's trying to keep Harry away from school or get him sent home once he's actually there. Best case scenario. Maybe he avoids underage magic in the warning that he gets in last chapter. Maybe he's able to keep the leverage over the Dursleys that he is a magic boy and he can make bushes burn and whatnot. Maybe. It might be fair to say that without this warning, it would have changed the beginning of Order of the Phoenix as well. Because he wouldn't have had this official warning. So when he uses his Patronus in Order of the Phoenix, maybe he doesn't have the harsh of a penalty of the Ministry immediately trying to expel him and snap his wand in half. But let's be honest. Fair, unfair, protocol, no protocol, following wizard law, not following wizard law, at that point in this story, nothing was going to change that attempted railroading. It just wasn't. So that wraps up our chat from last chapter. So that means, as I get my little cell phone here ready and run fingers through my hair as if it's going to make a difference, flip it around selfie style, and get ready to shoot a video because it's time for this week's Expecto Plot Change-O question from Chapter 3 in Chamber of Secrets, The Burrow, is, what if Vernon woke up sooner and was actually able to stop Harry from escaping with the Weasley brothers? Do they get away, go to their parents? Does Dumbledore somehow get involved? How does Harry get to Hogwarts if Vernon's able to stop this basically flying car kidnapping? Let me know your thoughts, to be included in the next episode. This video that I just shot will be posted on social media across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on the TikTok. You can respond with your thoughts on any of those platforms or as a voicemail on my website, belatedbinge.com. Now, it's time to dive into the events of this week's chapter with
Priority in chapter.
We've reached the point where our wands connect, not the tips, just the streams, so that we can recap what went down in the chapter that we just read. This week, Chapter 3, The Burrow, starts with Ron Weasley just kind of chilling outside of Harry's barred window in the middle of the night, which seems perfectly normal. Just as normal as him doing so hanging out of the back of a floating car. Did you forget that this is a magic series? Because we're reminded smacked in the face right now with a Ford Anglia. Who else is there? You might ask. If you didn't ask, I'm going to tell you anyways, because this is my podcast and I make the rules, and we go down whatever tangent I feel like. The twins. That would be Fred and George Weasley, because a flying car excursion is required to have the masters of shenanigans on board, and one of them actually driving said car, because let's be honest, Ron's not pulling this off on his own. Ron can't pull off his trainers on his own. See that? I used the word trainers because that's how they talk overseas, and it makes me sound cultured, but really it's just said in the book a bunch of times. And I figured if I told you that he couldn't pull off his boots, you'd say, hey Zach, he doesn't wear boots, he wears trainers. Again, we go down whatever the hell tangent I want to on this podcast. Rather than making this escape from the Dursleys as quick as humanly possible, they start and try to talk about why Harry didn't answer his letters and and why he did magic in front of the Muggles in the first place. And we also get an attempt at explaining how flying a magic car is somehow different than doing magic. I don't make the rules here. I'm just a grown man reading kids' books and talking about them on a podcast in the hopes of entertaining the tens of you listening so that I can one day become a full-time podcaster instead of working for a living, one patron at a time. So that got real. Partially, we need the plot to move forward, and partially because the twins might be the greatest background characters in the history of young adult or possibly all of written fiction, they're able to pull the bars off the windows like a flying redneck at the truck pulls, and they're also masters at stealth and lockpicking like they're trying out to be in a Fast and Furious heist movie. Probably lucky number 13 when they'll pull an alien spacecraft out of the sky with the magic power of a V8 and family. R.I.P. Paul Walker and the watchability of what was once my favorite movie franchise. And they almost got out unblemished. But Harry's the worst. We're like a page or two after him being actually a quite responsible pet owner by saving the last of his cold soup and giving it to Hedwig in her cage, despite the fact that she was not super stoked about it. But he was, practically being starved in his bedroom prison and still remembering to feed the owl. But now, as he's gonna escape that bedroom hell prison, he forgot Hedwig. She screeches, wakes up Vernon. Vernon comes blasting in the door, tries to grab Harry from, and I'm going to use air quotes here, escaping, and Harry barely gets free. Unlike the movie, he did not drag Vernon out the window to tumbling what we could only hope would be a broken neck, but at least Harry's out of the Dursleys, at least until next summer when he goes back and they pretend that none of this shit ever happened. This is where a lot of people bring up the fact that Vernon wants to keep Harry from escaping. Again, those air quotes. Like, rather than be rid of this kid that he absolutely hates from his house, he would prefer to keep him locked up as a prisoner and be certain that he's absolutely miserable and not doing magic. Because he's a twisted individual who might have turned out to be a serial killer if these books were about him and not about Harry. So now we're in a flying car, like you do. Hedwig, now flying along after being caged all summer, it's kind of a wonder that she didn't just plummet to the ground like when you try to stand up after your legs fall asleep. I'm kind of surprised that her wings didn't, take a minute to get some feeling back in them, but she did not plummet to the ground. She flew along very gracefully, I imagine, by the car. On the ride, on the, the flight on the way to the across the country place where the Weasleys live. And during this ride or flight or whatever we're calling it, he tells his ginger friends about Dobby and all the nonsense, and they hypothesize about who's plotting what and where Dobby came from and who's Dobby's master? They actually guess that Draco might be behind the whole thing, and that his family would be old and rich enough to have a house elf. Ding for our little detectives. But they have no idea why or what the plot would actually be. They kind of land on it being a prank/joke plan thing by Draco to just stop Harry from coming back to Hogwarts, because of course he would be obsessed enough with getting Harry out of Hogwarts during the summer to try such a thing after so many failed attempts during their first year in school. Of course, when put in that light, it actually makes a lot more sense. Because seriously, all of book 1, what was Draco doing? Literally just trying to get Harry thrown out of school. Very annoying, actually. Then we get some small talk about Percy being weird, their dad working at the ministry, and what his job is, and kind of the hypocrisy of his job being to catch people enchanting muggle stuff while they drive a car he enchanted to fly. Until, of course, it lands. And we're at the Burrow. It's named the Burrow because, well, that's what the sign out front says that it is. Of course. This has got to be a thing that happens across the pond, I would assume. Maybe it happens here in the U.S. more, but I haven't seen people just naming their homes unless it's like an Airbnb or a rental kind of situation. I've seen plenty of people put signs out in front of their house, but normally it's just got like their last name on it or something, not a fictional name of said house. Maybe I should name my house. See if it catches on. Be a trendsetter? Probably not. And the way that the Burrow's described is pretty much just as whimsical as you want it to be. Multiple stories high that appear to be held up by magic, almost as if the magic people who lived there just kept popping out kids and had to keep adding on to their house to fit them all in. Ron's a little hesitant and apologetic. Harry actually thinks the house is amazing, which I think makes Ron feel a little bit better. And at that point, we're all kind of feeling good and thinking that, all right, here we go. We're just going to sneak inside. We're going to go to bed, and nobody's going to even know we were gone. But that's not how sneaking out works. No. Here comes Mama Bear Weasley looking like a saber-toothed tiger, which is terrifying. She doesn't even let them get inside. She comes right across the yard and starts laying into them in only the way that a worried Mama Bear can. This actually reminds me of a time that I snuck out as a kid. Mom listens to this podcast. The only time I ever snuck out as a kid. A friend was staying over. I don't remember what friend it was. We got out of the house. We jumped on our bikes to go somewhere. I don't remember where we were going. Knowing the time and age that we were, there was likely a girl or toilet paper involved somehow. We made it about a mile or so down the road of the neighborhood that we lived in. I'm guesstimating at a mile. I don't actually know how far it was, but I can tell you that we were right by the public pool that was there. And at this time, my mom drove a lowered Honda Del Sol with a really loud exhaust, which was always a shock to people when she pulled up somewhere. And even more of a shock when two preteen boys after curfew heard it pull up behind them. It was a really long ride back home and a very unpleasant experience. I'm sure that Mom remembers this exact Mama Bear feeling. Anyways, the iconic screaming at her kids, "No, car gone!" You know the lines at this point, juxtaposed to her pleasantries with Harry. It's kind of a classic Molly MI7 Kids Weasley moment. But to Harry's surprise, even after this, she makes breakfast. Still giving her own kids shit. He meets Ginny for about half a second before she freaks out at the very sight of him and runs away. It's really good to know that in this series, you really can marry the famous person you're obsessed with growing up. But we're not there yet. And after Molly feeds everyone, instead of letting him go to bed, she makes him stay up and do chores. Outside, in the sun. Molly MI7 Kids Weasley for the win. The activity, de-gnoming the garden, which is a thing where you apparently catch live gnomes, which I think are supposed to look like the little garden gnomes that you have probably in your garden or you've seen probably around Christmas time with the beards and the hats and all of that. I think we're supposed to believe that they're just alive. And what you do to de-gnome a garden in the wizarding world with them is pick them up and swing them around and around and around and around and around and throw them as far as you can, which sounds hysterical. And then Papa Weasley comes home from work because apparently you work third shift sometimes when you work for the ministry with no explanation at all. And he gets it. he gets it good from his wife. And by get it, I mean he catches shit. This is PG, kids. Super PG. But basically, she's not stoked that he enchanted that car in the first place. And there's a little back and forth, to say the least. But it does get interrupted by Arthur realizing that Harry Potter is at his house and that he arrived by way of said flying car. And his reaction did not land well with his wife. You can vividly just see the movie scene, right? How'd it go? Oh, that was very wrong indeed. That part, yeah. That pretty much captures the Arthur Weasley portion of this. I don't think that the movie quite captured the Molly Mama Bear Weasley part as much, though. But as the two adults in the room are, I'd say, having a discussion about what has taken place, the kids sneak away to Ron's room, and by kids at this point I mean Ron and Harry, which is decorated in orange for the Chudley Cannons Quidditch team. And if I'm not mistaken, that's like the last time we actually hear of that. I might be mistaken, let me know. And Ron's a little bit embarrassed again at the size of his room and all of that, but Harry ends the chapter saying it's the best house he's ever been in. And that wraps up the chapter, bringing us to